Hi, this is History with me, Dan, and this is a video about the north side of Asylum Street, just west of Main Street in Hartford, Connecticut. Today, this is a long parking lot, but before the late 20th century, this block was filled with many buildings occupied by different businesses over the years. In other videos, I've talked about many lost buildings that once stood along this block, including Hartford's first skyscraper at the corner of Asylum and Main, and buildings further west down the block near the Brownstone Building at the corner of Asylum and Trumbull Streets. I'll link those videos in the description below, but in this video, I'm going to talk about what used to be just west of the corner of Main and Asylum. Businesses that once existed here include a prominent clothing store, several lunchrooms, and a business college. Today, the only structure at the northeast corner of Main and Asylum Streets is Smokey's Convenience Store. Before Smokey's, this was the site of an 11-story building erected in 1912 for the Hartford National Bank. It was later known as the Hartford-Aetna Realty Building. Although it does not seem very big compared to the Travelers Tower and more recent tall buildings, the Hartford-Aetna Building is considered to have been Hartford's first skyscraper. It was torn down in 1990 to make way for a new office tower planned by Society for Savings that was never built. Before the Hartford-Aetna Building, the corner was briefly occupied by another commercial building, a 6-story structure originally home to the George O. Sawyer Dry Goods Company. This building stood from 1897 to 1911. But let's go back just a little further to the building before that. It was yet another commercial structure, this one being 3.5 stories tall. It was erected in about 1821 by Henry L. Ellsworth and became known as the Catlin Building because the dry goods store of Julius Catlin was located here for many years. As I mentioned, I talk about the history of this corner a lot more in another video. But let's move westward, up Asylum Street. On the left is a section of a photograph taken in the aftermath of the blizzard of 1888. It shows the L that extended along Asylum from the rear of the Catlin Building. A prominent sign advertises one of the retail establishments that rented space in the building, Freeman's one-price clothing bazaar at 14, 16, and 18 Asylum Street. The store was established in 1861 by Solomon I. Freeman and opened at 14 to 16 Asylum Street in March of 1876. It would continue at this location for close to 2 decades until it moved a few doors down in 1895 to the building at 34 to 38 Asylum Street. This was a 3-story building with a projecting roof cornice. Freeman would extensively remodel the structure, as shown in the image on the right, taken in 1897. He added decorative detailing around the windows on the front facade and an elaborate railing and a swan's neck pediment on the roof. Just below the roofline, the name Freeman was prominently inscribed. The clothing store initially occupied only the ground floor, but in 1916 it expanded to include the second floor. Architect William T. Marchant was hired to design a new 2-story front for the first 2 floors of the building, that featured large modern display windows. As the Hartford Courant newspaper reported on February 15, 1916, quote, W.T. Marchant, the architect, said yesterday he thought the new front on the store would add much to the appearance of Asylum Street, although the width of the street is insufficient to give the passing public a true idea of the artistic merit, unquote. By the time of the 1916 remodeling, the store had gone through some management changes. In 1897, it had briefly become the Freeman-Tibbles Company, but a year later, it became the Freeman-Church Company when Henry E. Church, who was Freeman's son-in-law and who also already owned stores of his own in Putnam and Danielson, Connecticut, took over management. As described in the Hartford Courant on October 31st, 1898, quote, the new management proposed to make this store an ideal merchandising place. Already the thrill of new life has invigorated the departments. New goods, new ideas, new prices are all apparent to the patrons of the store, as well as the firm's new policy to cover the field of novelties as never has been done before by anybody in town. The Freeman-Church Company's store is located right in the heart of the trading district, and under the new impetus given to it by so enterprising a hustler as Mr. Church, much success is predicted for it in the future, unquote. In 1902, Church took over full control of the company from Freeman. In 1916, when the store expanded, it also adopted a new policy of selling exclusively men's clothing. 14 years later, in 1930, Church sold the store to a new owner from New York City. And 2 years later, Freeman-Church moved across Asylum Street to space in the Corning Building at the address 17 to 19 Asylum Street. The company remained there for 8 years, going bankrupt in 1940. As for the old Freeman Building, in 1957 it was acquired by the famous Hartford jeweler Bill Savitt, who hired the architectural firm of Kane and Fairchild to prepare a new modern facade for the old building, consisting of a glass block front with aluminum trim. The building, shown in a 1970s photograph on the left, displayed a large sign reading hardware. This is because in 1958, Greenspon's hardware store moved in and would remain in the building for the next 30 years. The store had started out in 1919 on State Street, but when Hartford's old East Side was being demolished for redevelopment in 1958, the store moved to 36 Asylum Street. When its lease wasn't renewed in 1989, the store moved to Ann Street, but it went out of business a year later. Returning to the 1897 view, just to the east, between the Freeman Building and the rear L of the Catlin Building, was the 5-story Hills Building, which had an elaborate facade and a triangular decorative gable at the top. A sign along the side of the building indicates that one of its tenants was Huntsinger's Business College. This institution gave young men and women instruction in such subjects as bookkeeping, shorthand, typewriting, penmanship, letter writing, spelling, and business law. The school, which opened in 1888, was run by E.M. Huntsinger. It was in operation for at least the next 30 years, soon becoming the largest institution of its kind in the state. later called Huntsinger's Business School, Inc. Its graduates included many people who became prominent in the Hartford business and insurance community. The ground floor of the building was occupied by various clothing stores over the years, and later, in 1914, the Baldwin Lunchroom opened. This was part of Baldwin's Incorporated of Springfield, one of the many lunchroom chains that were flourishing at the time. The Baldwin Lunch eventually came under the control of the Waldorf system of lunchrooms. In 1924, Waldorf sold the restaurant to the Wooster Lunch, which was located a few doors to the west on Asylum Street. It thus became the Wooster Lunch Annex. I'll talk a bit more about the Wooster Lunch in a few moments. In 1929, the building was demolished and replaced with a new building built for subletting by Schulte United stores. This was at the same time as Schulte United erected a building on Main Street. Within a short time, that Main Street store became a J.J. Newberry's. As for the Asylum Street building, its first tenant was the A. Schultz cigar store. At some point, this one-story building was enlarged and given a modern glass facade, as shown in the picture on the left, taken in 1978. Both that building and the neighboring Freeman building were acquired by Society for Savings and demolished just before the Hartford-Aetna Building came down in 1990. Just west of the Freeman, later Greenspon Hardware Building, there was already an open area in 1978. The image on the right, dating to 1969, shows the two structures that had once stood there: the Hoover Building, erected in 1928, and the Worcester Building, erected in 1914. These two buildings were torn down in the early 1970s by Society for Savings to create what was then called a mini mall, an open area leading to the rear entrance of Society for Savings building on Pratt Street. The Hoover and Worcester buildings had themselves replaced two earlier mid-19th century buildings shown in the 1897 photograph on the left. In 1914, Eli Pakulski purchased the 19th century building at 56-60 Asylum Street. He tore it down and in its place erected the Wooster Building. Pakulski had started out as a barber in Danbury, soon expanding into billiard halls and roller skating rinks. He eventually moved his business into the Wooster Building in Danbury, and he would use the Wooster name for his later business ventures. For his Hartford building, he opened the 3 upper floors for billiards and bowling, while the first floor contained the Worcester Cafe, which offered beer, whiskey, and cocktails. His advertising declared, quote, "All mixed drinks are blended in our new electric mixers, which assure a far superior blending to that obtained by handshaking or stirring," unquote. The interior of the cafe, which also featured an extensive cigar department, was finished in Circassian walnut, imported from 2 Georgian ports on the Black Sea that were at the time part of the Russian Empire. With the start of Prohibition in 1919, Pakulski transformed the Worcester Cafe into the Worcester Shop, selling French pastries, ice cream, and Worcester candy. It would soon expand as a restaurant. This photograph shows part of the ground floor of the Wooster Building in 1917. The Wooster Cafe, later called the Wooster Shop, was on the left beyond the frame of this picture. The business on the right was the sporting goods store of Andrus and Nadelli. The center space was occupied by Thompson's, a branch of the John M. Thompson cafeteria chain of Chicago. This Hartford branch of Thompson's was not successful, so in January of 1919, Pakulski took it over and renamed it the Wooster Lunch. A year later, he celebrated the fact that over 750,000 people had purchased meals at the restaurant in the last 12 months. As I mentioned before, in 1924, the former Baldwin, later Waldorf Lunch nearby, became the Wooster Lunch Annex. Pakulski, who had started in business by borrowing $100 to start his Danbury billiard hall, eventually sold his Asylum Street holdings in Hartford for a reported $1 million in 1927. He tried retirement, but could not keep away from the restaurants he had started. He briefly returned to the management of the Wooster Shop, which closed in 1930. Then he returned to the Wooster Lunch, which he enlarged in 1934 and reopened as the Georgia Cafeteria. This new restaurant went bankrupt in 1941. Eli Pakulski died the following year at the age of 74. The Worcester bowling alleys continued into at least the 1950s. In 1949, the Leopold Morse clothing store would move into the building. When Eli Pakulski had sold his Asylum Street properties, these included the 19th century building at 40 to 46 Asylum Street, just east of the Wooster Building. Its new owners, Nathan Spiegel and David Kaplan, demolished it and replaced it in 1928 with the 7-story Hoover Building, designed by the architects Buck and Sheldon. A tenant of the building that they had just demolished was Bill Savitt, who briefly relocated his jewelry store to Main Street before moving into the Hoover Building, where he would remain until moving again in 1936 to his famous location across the street. By then, Eli Pakulski had reacquired his former property by buying the Hoover Building in 1930. As I mentioned, both the Hoover and Wooster buildings were demolished in the early 1970s, followed nearly 2 decades later by the rest of the buildings I've talked about in this video. The Hartford-Aetna Building was demolished on April Fool's Day, 1990. This picture shows the rubble left in the aftermath of that implosion. It also shows the old rear entrance of Society for Savings that I mentioned before had been constructed when the Wooster and Hoover buildings had been demolished. Soon this rear section of Society for Savings was also removed, leaving us with the open parking area that exists today. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. I'd greatly appreciate it. And thanks for watching.